check if you can see the blackboard and the PowerPoint here on the right side of your screens. All right, great. All right, so today we're gonna be starting our discussion of the body fluids, which is directly connected to the kidney and the urinary system. First, we are discussing the body water content. Water represents between 45 to 75% of the body weight. It's going to be much higher in infants, representing 73% of the total body weight. In adult males, water is representing around 60% of the body weight. In females, it's going to be less than in males. It's going to be around 50% of the total body weight. As a person gets older, in older age, water going to be representing around 45% of the total body weight. So why do I have this variation? How come females have less body water content compared to males? How come an older person gonna have less body water percentage compared to an adult? And so why do I have this variation? It's a very simple concept. So all your cells contain on the inside cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm, if you remember, it was formed by the inclusions, organelles, and the cytosol. Cytosol was mainly formed of water. This is the substance that fills the cells. This is, generally speaking, all the cells. We've seen one exception for this general rule. It was the fat cells. If you remember, the fat cells did have large vacuoles that contain the stored triglycerides. So the fat here occupies most of the size of the cell, compressing the nucleus to the peripheral part. So here I don't have much water inside the fat cells. It's going to be mainly containing triglycerides or fat. So what's going to be the relationship between the body fat content and the water content? They are opposing one another. So if I have less fat in the body, this means I have more water. And if I have more fat in my body, so the percent of fat is going to be greater. So as a result, the representation of the water in terms of my body weight gonna be decreased. So why females gonna have less water than males? Because males will have more skeletal muscle cells or larger size muscle cells. Compared to females, they have less muscles, so they have more of the cells that contain cytoplasm. And females, they have higher body fat content. So here in females, I have more fat cells compared to the muscle cells. So the representation of the water content is going to be decreasing. We divide the total body water into two main compartments. We have the fluid inside the cells. This is called my intracellular fluid compartment. And I have the fluid outside of the cell. This is called my extracellular fluid compartment. So you have your total body water going to be split into two main compartments. Inside your cells, this is intracellular fluid. Outside of the cells, this is going to be extracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid is going to be representing about 2/3 of the amount of water that I have in the body. 2/3 of the body water, total body water, is going to be located inside my cells, compared to just 1/3 of the total body water is going to be outside of the cells in the extracellular fluid compartment. Extracellular fluid compartment can be subdivided into two main compartments. I have the fluid that will be surrounding the cells. This is called my interstitial fluid. And I have the fluid located within my blood vessels, where the blood cells are going to be circulating, which is my plasma. Interstitial fluid is going to be representing around 12 liters of fluid, compared to the plasma is going to be about 3 liters, containing 3 liters of water. Do you have any extracellular fluid other than interstitial fluid, the fluid around the cells, and the plasma? Do you have any other fluid that is located outside of the cells, but it's not part of the plasma, it's not part of the interstitial fluid? We've got many examples on here. Like, for example, if you remember, when we studied the CNS, we mentioned that the brain and the spinal cord are going to be surrounded by a fluid, and also this fluid is going to be inside 4 ventricles and the central canal of the spinal cord. You remember, what did we call this fluid that circulates inside and around my central nervous system? This is my exactly cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid, if you remember, was circulating within the ventricles of the brain, central canal of the spinal cord, and around the brain and spinal cord in the subarachnoid space. Another example of a fluid that is part of my extracellular fluid compartment, but it's not part of the interstitial fluid or my plasma, is going to be the fluid located in the synovial joints, as you are mentioning here, the synovial fluid. If you remember, your synovial joints were formed by articulating bones, between which you've got a very shallow space. And this space was filled by a fluid called the synovial fluid. Synovial fluid. Another fluid that we have seen before, it is not inside the cells, but still not part of my plasma or my interstitial fluid. If you remember, when we studied the anatomical structure of the eye, we've seen the aqueous humor that was occupying the anterior segment of the eye, and the vitreous humor, which was occupying the posterior segment of the eye. So the humeri here, the humors of the eye are going to be part of the extracellular fluid, but they are not part of the interstitial fluid or my plasma. Also, if you remember, serous fluids, this was the thin amount of fluid that was located between the two layers of the serous membranes. And we've got three famous serous membranes. If you remember, around the lungs, we've got the pleura. Around the heart, we've got the pericardium. And around the gastrointestinal tract and the other abdominal organs, this was my peritoneum. So if you remember, those serous membranes, each of them did have two layers, a layer that is directly attached to the organ it's covering. We call this is my visceral layer. And another layer that will be lining the cavity where the organ is going to be kept. So we call this is my parietal layer. Between the two layers, we did have a very shallow space, and in the space, we've got a very small amount of fluid. We call this fluid is my serous fluid. Also, another type of fluid that is not going to be considered as intracellular, it's still located outside of the cells, but it's not part of my plasma or my interstitial fluid. It's going to be the gastrointestinal tract secretions. So I've got the saliva, I've got the gastric secretions, I've got the intestinal secretions, or those secretions going to contain fluid, which is not going to be considered as intracellular, it's not going to be interstitial, and it's not going to be definitely plasma. So the secretions of the gastrointestinal tract also going to be extracellular fluid, which is not plasma, which is not interstitial fluid. The composition here of the body fluids, the main composition is going to be water. Inside the body fluids, we're going to have electrolytes. And electrolytes, those are solutes that have the ability to dissociate in water, like sodium chlorine, for example. When you put it in water, it splits into two ions, sodium and chloride. Inorganic salts, acids, bases, all of them would be considered electrolytes if they carry a charge. Non-electrolytes, those are going to be more complex structures like glucose, lipids, creatinine, and urine. Mainly large nutrients and wastes. The major cation, as you remember from our previous discussions of the action potential, if you remember, what was the major cation on the outside in the extracellular fluid, in the outside of the cells? Cation means the positively charged ion. What was the major cation outside of the cells? That when you allowed it in, it allowed the depolarization of your cells, either nerve cells, muscle cells. Sodium. And can you remind me what was the major cation inside my cells in the intracellular fluid? Potassium. And if you remember, the potassium was responsible for repolarization. So you've got the sodium. It's present at high concentrations outside of the cells in the extracellular fluid compartment. Compared to potassium, it is present inside of my cells in the intracellular fluid compartment. Major anions like the chlorine, bicarbs, those are the major anions in the extracellular fluid. Major anions in the intracellular fluid gonna be the hydrogen phosphates. So if you notice on here, the concentration of the different electrolytes in the intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid. So you see sodium on here, it is the major cation in the extracellular fluid compartment. So I will see very high levels of sodium in the interstitial fluid and in my plasma. Compared to potassium, potassium here is the major cation in the intracellular fluid compartment. So I see it only high in the cells, in the interstitial fluid compartment. Okay, it is going to be very low in my extracellular fluid compartment. If you notice here, bicarbs, chlorine going to be high in my extracellular fluid compartment. Those are the major anions of the extracellular fluid compartment. Hydrogen phosphate is going to be the major anion in the intracellular fluid compartment, so you will see very low levels of it inside the cells, outside of the cells, but high levels of it inside of the cells in the intracellular fluid compartment. So what do you notice on here? You will notice that blood and interstitial fluid, either they will go up together or down together. So they have almost the same concentration of solutes. The only exception for this general rule is going to be the proteins, protein anions. Why do you think you're going to have proteins in your blood, proteins in your cells, but you don't have proteins in the interstitial fluid? What do you think? Or let me ask you the question in a different way. Why would you have proteins in the cells and proteins in the blood? What do you think? Anybody still here? All right, so why do you think you have high protein concentration in the blood and high protein concentration in the cells, and you don't have almost any protein in your interstitial fluid? What do you think? Any guesses? So why do you have proteins inside your cells? Why do you have proteins inside your cells? You have proteins because they act as enzymes. They will carry on all the metabolic reactions that are taking place inside the cell. So I need proteins inside my cells, yes. Do you need proteins in the blood? Yes, I have plasma proteins. Like what? Like coagulation factors. Like a plasma protein that is responsible to increase the blood pressure. What was it that we've mentioned last class that needs to become activated by the renin? Do you remember? What do we call this plasma protein? Angiotensinogen, yes. So angiotensinogen is a plasma protein. I have many plasma proteins which are essential for me to maintain homeostatic balance. And inside my cells, I have the cytoskeleton, I have the enzymes, I have peroxisomes that contain hydrolytic enzymes and other enzymes for oxidation in the. So I need lots of proteins in the cell. I have lots of proteins in the blood, but do I have any need of keeping any protein in the interstitial fluid around the cells? Do you need protein here in between your cells in the interstitial fluid? No, you don't. There is no function for them on here. If I got burn or there is a leakage in the capillaries, if the proteins escaped from the blood vessels and now they are located in the interstitial fluid, what's going to happen? I will have swelling, I will have edema. All right, so normally I don't have protein in the interstitial fluid compartment because they don't provide me with any specific function in this place. But I do need proteins in my plasma. I do need proteins inside my cells. All right, is this clear? Why I have no proteins in the interstitial fluid compared to inside the cells and in the plasma? Is this concept clear? All right, so if you remember, what are the two pressures that will play a role in the movement of fluid? If you remember, when we discussed the filtration, we mentioned that there are two different types of pressures that will play an effective role in allowing the filtration to take place. Hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure, exactly. So what did we mean by hydrostatic pressure? If you remember, we did have this test tube. If you added water on one side, it will keep moving, and the weight of the water is what's going to be driving the fluid. It's what's going to be driving the water to move from this side to the other side. The weight itself. This is hydrostatic pressure. And the other effective pressure that played a role in the fluid movement, if you remember, this was the osmotic pressure. If I have a semi-permeable membrane and I have high concentration of solutes on the left side on here compared to on here, although I have the same amount of fluid, what's going to happen? Water moves from low solute concentration to high solute concentration. Until when? Until I equalize the concentration of the solute on both sides of the membrane. So what did we call this water movement on here? This is osmosis. The ability of the solute to pull water, this is my osmotic pressure. So if we're drawing here the three main compartments of the body water, intracellular fluid compartment, interstitial fluid, and the plasma. All right, so which one do you think gonna have a higher solute concentration? One, two, or three? Plasma, interstitial fluid, or intracellular fluid? Which one has higher solute concentration? What do you think? Plasma? Plasma? Here I got one vote for plasma. What do you think? Two, all right, three. Any other? Four. Interstitial got one. So here are five. I'm waiting for the other 14 to vote. Which one has a higher solid concentration? Intracellular fluid compartment, interstitial fluid compartment, or plasma? Plasma, 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 plasma. All right, so let me tell you here what's going to happen if the plasma had higher solid concentration. So if I have lots of solids, higher solid in the plasma, what's going to happen? So you've got one vote here, interstitial fluid. All right, so what happens if the plasma did have high solid concentration? What's going to happen? According to what we just mentioned, water moves by osmosis from the side with low solute to the side with high solute. So what's going to happen? Water is going to be moving from the interstitial fluid to my blood. So what's going to happen as a result to the concentration of solutes in my interstitial fluid? It will increase as you're pulling out water. So what's going to happen next? Water will start to move from the cells to the interstitial fluid, and as a result, what's going to happen to the cells? Cells will shrink. Do you want your cells to shrink? No. All right, so we've got one vote for interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid, if I do have a high solid concentration in the interstitial fluid, what's going to happen? Water, again, going to be moving from low solid concentration inside the cells to the interstitial fluid, and from the blood to the interstitial fluid. So what I will be doing is I will be accumulating water or fluid around the cells. I will have edema. And what happens as a result to the cells? The cells, again, will shrink. All right, we've got one vote here for intracellular fluid. So the question now is intracellular fluid going to have high solid concentration compared to the other compartments? What's going to happen to the cell? If it has high solid concentration, again, water moves from low solute to high solute. Water moves from low solute to high solute. So what's going to happen in this case? The cell's going to be swelling. Do you want the cells to swell? No. So which one has a higher solid concentration? Cells, intracellular fluid, interstitial fluid, or plasma? Which one has a higher solid concentration? Any answer? They are equal. they have to be equal. Because if I have extracellular fluid compartment having higher solid concentration compared to my cells, they will be pulling the water out of the cells will shrink. What's going to happen if I have higher solid concentration in the intracellular fluid? The cell's going to be pulling water from outside, so the cell's going to be swelling. I don't want the cells to swell or to shrink. I want to maintain the same size without interfering with the metabolic activities. So again, water here, we're going to be moving freely by osmosis between the different body fluid compartments, as almost always they are equal. They are almost always equal. Concentration of solids in the cells going to be equal to the interstitial fluid, going to be equal to the plasma. Almost always equal. Two-way osmotic flow going to be taking place. Slight variations going to be putting water in and out just to carry the solutes in and out of the different fluid compartments. Change in solid concentration in any compartment is going to lead in either net water gain or loss. You don't want to have a net water gain, cells going to be swelling. You don't want to have a net water loss because the cells going to be shrinking. So again, which one of the three compartments on here has a higher solid concentration? Which one? Any? Which one has a higher solid concentration again? They all are equal. All are equal. All are equal. All are equal. All right, so water intake is going to be in the form of beverages, which are representing the largest amount of full fluid intake. They are representing 60% of the total water intake. Food going to be representing around 30% of the total water intake, the amount of water that you get from outside. And the metabolism is going to be representing around 10% of the water that you're getting. So because this is metabolic water, like what metabolic water? Water is that results from a metabolic chemical reaction. Like for example, as we're going to be studying in details later on when we discuss the metabolism of the glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6. It requires oxygen for it to be broken down. And when you break down the glucose in the presence of oxygen, this is going to result in the formation of carbon dioxide and water in order for you to produce energy or ATP. So this water is resulting from what? Did I drink this water? Did I get this water in the food I'm ingesting? No, it was resulting from a chemical reaction. So we call this as a metabolic water. And this kind of metabolic reactions are going to be providing you with around 10% of the total water intake. Compared to the water output, 4%, around 4% going to be lost in feces, 8% in sweat. Insensible water loss through the lungs and skin is gonna be around 28% of the total water loss or water output, and urine is gonna be representing around 60% of the total water output. So you see on here, beverages are almost equal to the amount of urine that gets released, 60%. So which one should be higher, the water intake or the water output? Should I be losing more or gaining more water? So which one do you pick? Intake should be greater than the output, or output should be greater than the water intake. Which one do you pick? One or two? Intake greater, intake, intake. So try to imagine that your intake is 1 liter, let's say, and your output was half liter. So you've retained today half liter. If you're retaining half liter of water per day, how would you look like in 5 years from now? So try to imagine that you're retaining the water intake is greater than the output, so you're gonna keep half liter. You're not losing it out. So how would you look like in 5 years, 20 years from now, if you're retaining every day half liter? So which one is greater now? Which one is greater now? One or two? Intake or output? Yes, they are equal. Intake is gonna need to be equal to the output. Intake is equal. You see on here, liter and half is lost in the urine. It's equal to the liter and half that you are drinking. And the other liter on here that you're getting from metabolism and food is going to be equal to the liters that you're losing out with the feces, sweat, and insensible water loss through respiration and skin. All right, so again, which fluid compartment gonna contain higher solid concentration? Intracellular fluid or extracellular fluid contains higher solid concentration? They are equal. Which one is greater? Many people tend to think that intake is greater than the output. People will keep telling you, yeah, you need to drink more water. All right, so people tend to think that getting more water is gonna be doing good. So it is gonna be logical that the intake is greater than the output. All right. All right, people tend to think that water intake is greater than output, but actually they are and should be equal. All right. Questions? Any questions? All right, so how do we regulate the water intake? The two main factors here that will be allowing you to regulate the water intake are going to be the plasma osmolarity and the plasma volume or the blood volume. So if I have water output greater than the amount of water that I'm taking. So here, water output is greater than the intake. What will tell me that I need to drink water? I need to take water from outside to maintain the balance in the body. If I have water output greater than the intake, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? The plasma volume will do what? If you're losing more than what you're taking, what's going to happen to the plasma volume that you've got? It's going to decrease, right? So I have a decrease in the plasma volume. And when I have a decrease in blood volume, what happens to my blood pressure? Can you remind me? Decrease in the blood pressure. And who hates low blood pressure? Do you remember? Kidney or heart? Kidneys. And what part in the kidney was responsible to respond to the drop in the blood pressure? Was my juxtaglomerular apparatus. And if you remember, this was detected by a type of cells in the juxtaglomerular apparatus called the granular cells. And granular cells, in response to the drop in the blood pressure, they are stimulated to release a hormone called renin. Do you remember how renin acts? How renin increases your blood pressure back to normal? Do you remember? Do I have any direct effect on the blood vessels as renin? What do you think? Do you have any direct action on the blood vessels for you to increase the blood pressure back to normal? What do you think? No, it did convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Remember, is the angiotensin 1 was an active hormone? No, it needs to be activated by another enzyme called the angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, which converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is the hormone that's going to be responsible to increase my blood pressure. If you remember, one of its actions, angiotensin 2 did stimulate the hypothalamic thirst center. So I stimulate the hypothalamic thirst center, gives me the thirst sensation. So it gives me the sensation that I need to drink a bit. All right, so again, what happens if I've got more output than the intake? I need to drink. How would I know that I need to drink? This is not something that you do it on a conscious level. It's not something that you will decide to do. It's subconscious. You feel thirsty, you drink water. All right, what makes you feel thirsty is the activation of the hypothalamic thirst center. How this takes place again, if I have more output than water intake, my plasma volume gonna drop. This is gonna cause a drop in my blood pressure. Drop in the blood pressure gonna be activating the juxtaglomerular apparatus, to be more specific, the granular cells of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And remember, granular cells, in response to the drop in the blood pressure, they release renin. Once I release renin, renin will be activating angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1 that gets converted into angiotensin 2 under the effect of ACE. And angiotensin 2 is the one who activates the hypothalamic thirst center, along with many other actions that we've discussed last class. What happens if the water output is greater than the water intake in terms of plasma osmolarity? Try to imagine this is my blood on here, or my plasma, and I have lost water. Try to imagine that your plasma is like a coffee, and you kept boiling the coffee. You kept losing water. So I'm losing water out. What's going to happen to the concentration of my plasma? The plasma osmolarity is the concentration of solutes in the plasma. What happens to the plasma osmolarity if the water output is greater than the water intake? What do you think happens? If you kept boiling a cup of coffee, what happens to the concentration of this coffee? Will it become more concentrated or less concentrated? I'm not talking about the volume. I'm talking about the concentration. How concentrated would the coffee be if you kept boiling the coffee? Get a cup of coffee today and keep it in the microwave for 5 minutes. The volume of the coffee is gonna decrease, right? You've lost water, but how about the concentration of the coffee? Will it become darker or lighter in color? It becomes darker, so means what? It becomes more concentrated. So what happens to the coffee osmolarity? It's going up. Osmolarity is simply the concentration of solutes. So what happens to the plasma osmolarity if the output is greater than the intake? Plasma osmolarity goes up. High plasma osmolarity will have a direct activation of the hypothalamus through the osmoreceptors. So inside your hypothalamus, you have receptors that are responsible for detecting the increase in the plasma osmolarity. So osmoreceptors, they detect that you've got an increase in your plasma osmolarity, and they will be sending out the signals to your hypothalamic thirst center for you to get a thirst sensation. Another effect on here of the increased plasma osmolarity, what do you think is the source of the glandular secretions? So let's say here, this is a glandular cell. This is a salivary gland cell, one of the cells of the salivary gland. It's going to be secreting the saliva through the duct to be released out in the oral cavity. Where the saliva is coming from? It's coming from the cells that are forming the gland. But where the cells did get the fluid from? What do you think? Where the cells gonna be getting the fluid from to be released in the saliva? Do you store some of the fluid when you drink inside cavities somewhere and use them, or where do you actually get the fluid from? What do you think? Fluid is coming from the blood. So if I'm telling you that the plasma now has high solute concentration, plasma has higher osmolarity now, would you be able to move the water from the vessels, from the plasma to the cells of the salivary gland? What do you think? Remember, water moves normally from where to where? From low solute concentration to high solute concentration. Here I'm telling you that in my blood vessels, I have high solute concentration. I have higher plasma osmolarity. Would you be able to move the fluid from your vessels to the glands for this fluid to be released as saliva? Yes or no? What do you think? If I have high concentration of solutes in my blood vessels, would I be able to move the water from the vessel to my salivary glands? No. Why? Because high solute means I will be pulling the water towards me. So would I be able to release saliva in the oral cavity if I'm not able to get fluid from the vessels? No. So what would I develop? I will develop dry mouth. And the dry mouth is going to be activating the hypothalamic thirst center. So you see on here, how do I regulate the water intake? If I have higher output than intake, so I need to drink water, what activates the hypothalamic thirst center for me to get a thirst sensation? First, the drop in my plasma volume. Drop in plasma volume gonna be reflected on my blood pressure, gonna activate my granular cells to release renin, which will result in the conversion of angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, then gets converted into angiotensin 2 by the angiotensin converting enzyme, as we've discussed last class. And angiotensin 2 is the one who activates the hypothalamic thirst center. Also, if the intake is less than the output, the plasma osmolarity gonna increase. What I mean by increase in plasma osmolarity, this means that the concentration of solutes in my blood is going up. I have a direct effect on the hypothalamus by activating the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. I have an indirect effect on the hypothalamic thirst center that is caused by the increase in the plasma osmolarity. Again, when I have an increase in the plasma osmolarity, there will be a drop in the salivary gland secretions. This can result in dry mouth and the dry mouth is the one that activates the hypothalamic thirst center. Once the hypothalamic thirst center gets activated, this gives you a sensation of thirst, which will drive you to drink. The water, as it passes to the inside of your oral cavity, it's going to be moistening your mouth, your throat, and stretches the stomach. All this going to cause a negative feedback. So all this is going to be inhibiting the thirst sensation. And if you see in a game, for example, people while they are running, they just get water inside their mouth and they spit it out. Why? They are moistening the oral cavity to reduce the thirst sensation without actually getting the water in their stomach, because this might cause them to become nauseated. As water gets absorbed in the gastrointestinal tract, this will decrease my plasma osmolarity, so there will be no more activation of the osmoreceptors. I won't have any dry mouth anymore, and this will directly inhibit the thirst sensation. So once you drink water, the thirst sensation gonna be depressed. Questions? Questions? Any questions? All right, so moving on to the regulation of the water output. So how do I monitor and regulate the amount of water that I'm losing to the outside? There is an obligatory water loss, which is unavoidable. It's like the insensible water loss through the lungs and skin. You don't have any control on it. The amount of water that you lose with feces, and this is very important because it prevents you from having constipation. And the minimum daily sensible water loss in the urine that allows you to get rid of the metabolic waste like creatinine, like urea, like uric acid. So a minimum amount of urine that we're going to be releasing per day is about half liter. This is again the minimum amount of urine that we do release per day. All those are forms of unavoidable water loss. How do I regulate the amount of water that I'm losing to the outside of the body? Remember, the main player on here that regulates this water loss is going to be ADH, or anti-diuretic hormone. If you remember, the ADH was acting on which part of the kidney tubules? Was it on the proximal convoluted tubules, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubules, or the collecting ducts? Do you remember which part of the kidney tubules was the ADH acting on? Do you remember? ADH was acting on my collecting ducts by inserting aquaporine channels to allow the water to move from the filtrate back into my blood, retaining water. So if I don't have enough water intake, what would I do with ADH? I have an increase in the release of ADH. Why do I have an increase in the release of ADH? Because I want to retain as much water as I can, to not have a major drop in my blood volume, to not have a major drop in my plasma osmolality, a major increase in the plasma osmolality. What if I have a lot of water intake? What happens if I have a lot of water intake beyond my needs? What would I do? I inhibit the release of ADH. And if I inhibit the release of ADH, what's going to happen? All this amount of water that you are retaining going to be released out in the urine. So if you're having too much water intake, what happens to the urine concentration? You're going to have dilute urine. And if you have water deprivation, you're preventing yourself from drinking any water, what's going to happen to the concentration of the urine? It becomes much more concentrated. Again, who plays the major role in determining whether the urine is going to be dilute or is going to become concentrated is my ADH. So how again this takes place, very important concept. How ADH is going to be playing a role in determining whether the urine is going to be dilute or concentrated. If I have high water intake, I will do what to the ADH? I inhibit the release of ADH. Don't need ADH. So no water retention takes place. And this water, instead of moving back to my vessels, it's going to keep going out in the urine, resulting in dilute urine. What happens if I don't have enough water intake? At this point, I will be enhancing the release of ADH from the hypothalamus. And as I enhance the release of ADH going to be inserting those channels, aquaporine channels, again, in which part of the kidney tubules? Which part of the kidney tubules going to be responsible to form the aquaporine channels? Collecting ducts. And those collecting ducts will allow you to retain water. So I won't be allowing this water to be released out in the urine. So urine gonna contain higher solute concentrations, and this results in concentrated urine. All right, so again, in case of high water intake, what happens to ADH? At least 60–70% of the class will get this question wrong on the exam. What happens to ADH levels when you have any high water intake? High water intake inhibits ADH release. How about water deprivation? Low water intake. What happens to the concentration of ADH? What happens to the ADH release? It will be enhancing ADH release. Other factors that will be contributing in triggering the ADH release, other than the plasma osmolarity, would be fever, sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, water loss, and traumatic burns. So if you notice on here, what's common in all those: sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, blood loss, traumatic burns, what's common in all those that will be triggering ADH release? What's common in all those? I have high water loss. So in case of burns, I will be oozing fluid. Vomiting, I am losing fluid out. Bleeding, I'm losing fluid. Diarrhea, I'm losing fluid. So you don't have to wait until you actually lose the fluid and you get an increase in the extracellular fluid osmolarity for you to trigger the release of ADH. Even before having a major change in your extracellular fluid osmolarity, you're going to be responding to all those by releasing ADH because you already know that those, when present, I will have large amounts of water that will be lost. Questions? Questions? All right, so we can have a 10 minutes break. We come back, discuss more about the body. Any questions before we go for a break? All right, we'll see you in 10.